We left off in the second paragraph of the Shema, where we read that if you heed my mitzvos and you serve God with all your heart and all your soul, the rains will come in the time. You will have, the earth will give forth its bounty. You'll bring in the harvest, many levels. There'll be sufficient pasture, grazing land for your animals. You'll be sated. However, but you have to be careful. You should not be seduced by your hearts. You may be seduced by your hearts, and you'll veer and you'll serve alien gods, even to the point that you'll bow to them. You'll follow the protocols of the idolatry. We had mentioned in the first paragraph of the Shema, grammatically speaking, if you want to say your heart, it's libcha, not levovcha. But yet, when we speak about loving God, Torah says you must love God b'chol levovcha, double bays. Grammatically, there should have been one base. What's a double base? So the Talmud explains is because we have two inclinations. We have a positive inclination and we have a negative inclination. Meaning you must not only serve God with the positive inclination, which is understood, because that is an expression of your soul, but even with your negative inclination, which emanates from your physicality, because we are physical beings, and when we speak about the tree of knowledge, when it was ingested, the fruit, Adam was putrefied, and he allowed this foreign substance to enter into his being. That was only his physicality was impacted. It had nothing to do with his soul. It just caused that there was a greater struggle now between soul and body. So in the first paragraph of the Shema, we see that the love of God, not only must you love God with your positive inclination, but even with your negative, meaning you have to subordinate and submit your physicality to God. That's over there it says, the Torah uses the word levavcha rather than libcha, because it's understood with your positive inclination, of course, you must love God. But even the negative inclination, you must subordinate it and submit it and dedicate it to serve God. And how do you do that? By subordinating it. So that's the positive. Here we're speaking about after you're sated and God gives you all the bounty, Hishamru lachem. You have to be very careful. You may be seduced by your levavachem, by your positive, by what? By your hearts. Here it say libchem. Right? I mean, we're not speaking you're going to be seduced by the positive inclination. You're seduced by the negative inclination. But yet, when we speak about the hearts, it doesn't say libchem, it says levavchem. So in the context of being seduced and serving idolatry, how do we somehow include the positive inclination when this is clearly this is an expression of negative inclination? What exactly is this speaking about? You know, as human beings, we do many things and we want to do the right thing. And very often, we believe, although God says it's not the right thing, but ultimately, the means justifies the end. If ultimately, years ago, they used to speak of Robin Hood. He stole from the rich to give to the poor, but there was no justification to steal. Even though you're going to use that stolen property to alleviate the sufferings of the poor, but if it's through illegal means, you have no right to do it. So there are many things that we do that we rationalize and we say it's not so terrible because ultimately I'm doing the right thing. For instance, the law is that anything is of idolatrous nature, a Jew is not permitted to benefit from if it was used for idolatry. Not only are you not permitted to do idolatry, but something which is idolatrous, a Jew is not permitted to benefit from it, regardless of its material value. But you could say, if I could benefit from it, you know what I'm able to do with that value? I'm able to underwrite many important causes. God says, no, you're not permitted. It's taboo, it's off limits. You have to dispose of it. You must destroy it because it has a certain degree of representation. But factually speaking, it could be marketed. You can market it to the non-Jew. The non-Jew will pay for it. But you cannot be a beneficiary of anything which is of idolatrous nature. So although the intent is positive and you want your rational basis to override the provision, you have to submit your positive inclination and say, no, it's not permitted. The evil inclination is understood that that's doing the wrong thing. But here, what comes into play? Even the positive inclination comes into play. Because you could be hoodwinked and be convinced because you want to do the right thing. It's what? It's justified and you rationalize. Now, we've mentioned, and this is the Midrash speaks about it, in the first paragraph of the Shema, you speak about loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your possessions. In the second paragraph, and it's written in the singular. The first paragraph is written in the singular. The second paragraph is written in the plural. When we speak about the plural, we speak about with all your hearts and with all your lives, plural. It doesn't say with all your possessions. Why? Possessions doesn't necessarily mean just material. It means the amenities of life, the conveniences of life. Are you willing to forego that for God? Most people are not. They're not willing to forego that. Those are the few which you can count on one hand. The first paragraph is speaking about those in the singular who, due to the love of God, they're willing to give it all away. Their hearts, their lives, all their material amenities, all the conveniences, the pleasures of life for the sake of God. The second paragraph, we speak about the good Jews. They're serving God with all their hearts and giving their lives. But to live a life where you can live a life of deprivation for the sake of God, the average person is not at that level. There's no claim against him. We're not saying there's a claim against him. But most people are not at that special level. What does that mean? The first paragraph is speaking, and we mentioned this, a person that material pleasure, amenity doesn't speak to that person. That person cannot be hoodwinked. That person will not justify anything which is for the sake of the material. The second paragraph was speaking about a person who's not willing to give up the pleasures of life to serve God, meaning not where he's violating, but to be deprived to serve God at a more advanced level. That is not the average person. We always say that each man has his price, and the evil inclination knows exactly what our vulnerabilities are. For this number of persons that will never cross that line. But when the number becomes something astronomical and the opportunity seems to be something which is one of a kind that you can't pass on it, then all of a sudden the whisperings in your ear which say it's just this one time. But we don't realize when it's one time, there's a second time and a third time. And that's exactly how the evil inclination somehow hoodwinks us and draws us in. So because the second paragraph is speaking about a person who's vulnerable to material, because he is the person not willing to forgive the material, even though he's not in violation, because he has the needs. He needs those basic amenities, and he's not willing to give that up for the sake of God, which is no claim against him. But because that is something which you value, you may be seduced where what's presented to you is so attractive you can't turn it down. Therefore, we speak about God will give you all the bounty, give you this and that, but you have to be careful. And you'll be sated. But now you have to be careful because you are of that ilk or that classification that this plays a crucial role in your life. And it's important to you. You could be seduced by your hearts. Even the positive inclination is already subject to this perception. Because just as initially you weren't willing to give up the material amenities for serving God, so if that means you could put those material amenities in a context to serve God, where it may not be so. It may not be so. Therefore, we speak about b'chol levavchem. You'll be seduced by your hearts, not only the evil inclination, even the positive inclination, because within the positive inclination, you have this value of material, and you may justify to do the wrong thing for the sake of the material, because ultimately you'll think that the means justifies the end. But the end, you don't realize the end ends up where you're literally at the bottom of the hill. God forbid, that slope will bring you to idolatry. And if you come to idolatry, God forbid, God says, I pulled the plug on you. You will actually be subject to the wrath of God. And God will destroy you. And God will exile you. God will strip you of all the material. The material that you thought you were able to achieve and amass, despite his will, to justify it, God says, I'll teach you a lesson. It's not justifiable under any circumstance. Therefore, what continues is, V'choraf Hashem bochem, God will be enraged against you. And he will seal the heavens, v'lo yemotor. There will not be any rains. And if there's no rain, the earth, the ground, will not give its bounty. And you will be destroyed quickly from the good land, which God gives to you. Now, it's very interesting. You know, the Talmud is divided into 6 sections. The first section of the Talmud is known as Zroim. Zroim means seeds, plantings. It discusses the laws. For instance, a Jew is not permitted to crossbreed crops. There's certain laws which pertain to the land of Israel, that when you harvest your crop and you bring it in the harvest, it has to be tithed. You have to give a certain tithing to the Kohen. You have to give a certain percentage to the Levi. A certain percentage you have to take to Jerusalem to eat within the wall. There's time at the temple. During certain sabbatical years, you must take 10%, give to the poor. The laws which the produce of Israel is subject to. This is all within the first section of the Talmud. This is called Zroim. In Hebrew, the word Zroim means seeds. It has to do with plantings. The Talmud cites a verse from prophets which allude that the oral law is divided into 6 sections, and the first section is Zroim, is plantings. It's referred to as Emunah. Emunah means belief. Emunah, or faith. Emunah. Now, why is it called Emunah? You have a farmer. He has the best soil. He has the best fertilizer. It's virgin soil. He has the best seed. What happens if it doesn't rain? You can have the best soil, the best seed. If it doesn't rain, there's no, that seed is not going to grow. What happens even if you do have rain and you have blight, or if you have locust? you have a problem. That harvest will not be brought in. So what forces the farmer to have faith in God and pray to God? Anything that we believe that we are in control of, we immediately, naturally take credit for whatever it is. The farmer is forced to be a realist. The farmer is a realist. If it doesn't rain, nothing grows. And even if it rains, it doesn't rain sufficiently. The crop is not going to be what he hoped it to be. And even if the crop grows as it should grow, but there's blight, the crop actually is destroyed. And if there's locust, so how many variables have to be met to be able to bring in that bounty that the harvest should be correct? Many things, many levels have to fall into place to be able to succeed in bringing in that harvest. From the time you plant till you harvest, till you bring it into your silo. What do you need for that? You need a tremendous amount of faith and belief in God. Therefore, the section of the Talmud, which is Roim, which has to do with plantings, the prophet refers to as emunah. You have to have emunah. Without emunah, it doesn't work. And we're forced. It's very interesting. Going back before there was democracy, when there's monarchy, the average person, as bad as his life was, he basically believed in some kind of power, some kind of supreme power. Why? Why did he believe? His children die usually at a young age. Most children don't live to adulthood because of disease, because of miscarriage, because of plague, pogrom, many reasons. And life is very painful and difficult. But yet, despite the pain and the difficulty, this only intensifies their belief in whatever they believe in. Why? Well, because when a person has his feet put to the fire, and you realize that it's not you and there's no other survival, all of a sudden, the way God creates a human being, it evokes a level of understanding that it's not me, there is a higher power. And then you pray to whatever you believe in, that as bad as it is, it shouldn't be worse, or maybe it should get a little bit better. That's the reality. Once there was democracy, all men are created equal. Each man has an equal say. An opportunity is there, and there's affluence and there's bounty. Then what do we start believing? We believe that we are the power. I have no need to submit to anything other than what? Only it's my own initiative. And that is the challenge. When things are very bad and all society, see, very often, if other people are succeeding and one person has issues, it becomes a problem. Because the person feels, why is he being singled out? That evokes an anger, and the person becomes upset with God. But let's say unilaterally, all mankind is below the poverty level. All mankind has a similar fate. We're in the same boat. Everybody understands what the reality is. We know what we have to do. But if a person is singled out, when the average person doesn't suffer the way this person suffers, then that touches a certain nerve in him, which evokes a level of anger and pain. And that causes a person to bolt from God because he feels it's not fair. Why is God picking on him? Is he worse than anyone else? But if all society is unilaterally, they have the same fate, we all know what we have to do. We got to pull ourselves up from our own bootstraps and pray and have faith that that power should have mercy on us. And as I said, and alleviate our pain, or it should not get worse. So what does God do? It's because he was saved, because the bounty was brought in. and everything was perfect. Now you can be seduced by both, not only by your evil inclination, even by your positive inclination. That's something very interesting. Very rarely we meet a person, I'm talking even an observant Jew, even a person who's a philanthropist, who became very successful, but wealthy, where he doesn't believe that he understands it better than most people in regard to charitable causes. Something he believes he understands it even better than the rabbi. The rabbi who actually, it's his institution. He's the disseminator of Torah. He's mentoring the students. And he's giving the rabbi advice how to mentor students and how to do his own thing, which is not even his field. Why? Because if I succeeded more than the average person, and I underwrite, and I'm able to underwrite you to assist you in a serious way financially, evidently, I have some degree of know-how. What know-how do you have? When it comes to, if you have a cardiac issue, what do? Maybe you can research to get the best doctor, but how to deal with the medical issue, you don't know how to deal with the medical issue. When it comes to godliness, religion, of how you should and how you shouldn't, all of a sudden you become an expert because you tasted your level of success and you feel that you're superior to most people, and therefore you have a right and you believe you have an understanding. Truthfully, you don't have an understanding. But it's not uncommon. Very rarely will you find a person who totally will negate himself totally to a person of that special spiritual acumen. Very rarely. There is that ego, which is inflated due to the success the person has. Even though, God forbid, the person is an observant Jew. He's not bolting or anything, but there is something which that success somehow inflates his ego. You have wealth, you have success, only because you're doing the right thing initially. All of a sudden, you have to be careful now. You can be seduced by your hearts, by even your positive inclination, because you believe you know better than the rabbi. Rabbi says it's not the way to go. And he says, I disagree, Rabbi. I think it is the way to go. So where are you coming from? You're coming from the positive, not from the negative. You want to do the right thing. But the question is, what's more right? You know, there's a responsive, there was a great Torah sage who passed away in the late 50s, early 60s. He was the equivalent of Rabbi Feinstein, Zechet Tzaddik Lebrocha, blessed memory. His name was Rav Henkin, Rabbi Henkin. And he has a work, Responsa, where, and this question was asked to him in the early 50s, and it wasn't a custom for very few people who passed away in the United States were they interned in Israel, were they buried in Israel. Today, it's not uncommon. People who are observant and they could afford it, when they pass away, they want to be buried in Israel. But at one time it was almost unheard of unless you were exceptionally wealthy. And his family had posed the question to Rabbi Henkin. Their father passed away, and they want to bury their father in Israel. Why? Because there's a special merit to be buried in Israel. As it's discussed in the Midrash, in the Talmud, that it has special value to be buried in Israel. And we're not speaking about this family were great supporters of Torah. And especially in the 50s, where there very few people had means, and the Torah institutions were not really seriously supported, and they were in need of that material support. So they would wanted to invest a very significant amount of money, which was considered significant, for the transfer of the body to Israel the burial plot and everything that goes along with that. So Rabbi Henkin said to them, if you want to do what's best for the deceased, it should be a merit for his soul. The money that it would cost for all the services, traveling, transporting, burial, whatever it may be, if you would take that money and give it to a yeshiva to support Torah, it will be greater merit for that soul than burying him in Israel. That's what he wrote. If you want to do what's good for the deceased, give the money to charity to support Torah, not to bury him in Israel. Regardless of what that value is, it pales compared to what it means to supporting Torah. So you have two different positions. Well, but I want my relative to be buried in Israel. It doesn't say whether they listened, they didn't listen. They meant well. But here you have the expert rabbi who's the leading Torah decider in the world, and he's giving him good advice. Did they heed his advice? I don't know. But again, but let's say they did not. And they meant well, because they said, we prefer that. He's not telling him, you're doing the wrong thing, but if you want to do something more right, this is more right. Therefore, this is levavchem. Not only could you be seduced by your evil inclination, even by positive inclination. Because once you have the means, you believe you have a say, so to say. You have a grasp, you have an understanding. Rabbi Breuer, who founded the German community in Washington Heights before World War II, was known as the German community, and the shul in Washington Heights was a replica of the synagogue in Frankfurt, built exactly a replica of it. Its architecture, all the inner workings and the form, the arc was exactly a replica of Frankfurt. And when he would speak on Shabbos, he would speak in German. Of course, his constituencies, they were all German Jews. They didn't speak in English. He spoke English, but when he would give a sermon, he would give it in German. And he started to build the community, especially after the war. The survivors came over, and he not only was it a synagogue, he created an educational system, an elementary school, a high school, a post-high school, because he wanted to rebuild what they had in Europe. He wanted to rebuild in the United States. And he was an exceptional man. He himself was a grandson of Rabbi Hirsch, Rabbi Hirsch, who was the famous Torah sage from Germany, who had initially created an Orthodox community outside of the Reformed community. He was a grandson. And he was a German personality. They're very unbending, very firm. And if they're committed to a position, you can't move them as much as an iota. And there was a Jew, a very wealthy Jew, also from German descent, not exactly observant, but he valued and he revered Rabbi Breuer very much. And he said to Rabbi Breuer, he would like to help him build the community, and he would provide finances to help him build the community, build the Torah institutions, whatever he needs. And Rabbi Breuer said, of course, no, more than happy to have you on board. And after a short period, all of a sudden, this philanthropist, this German Jew, he starts advising Rabbi Breuer how to do things. I think this is the way you should do it. We have to fine-tune it. Rabbi Breuer says, I want to explain you something. You want to give charity, you want to be a philanthropist, you want to be a supporter, fine. But this is not your area of expertise. If I ask you for your advice, is one thing. But to offer your advice, if that's the case, thank you, no thank you. Take your money, go elsewhere. Not interested in your money. And what do you think the person did? He went elsewhere. But again, this Rabbi Breuer being a tzaddik, he was committed to his ideals and to his values. He would not compromise as much in iota, regardless at the cost factor that this money that's so dear, sorely needed to accomplish what he wants, is going to be put in jeopardy. God provides. It's not this person. If it's meant to be, it's going to be. And again, this is pen yifta levavchem. But you realize many people would have succumbed to this. It's okay. I'll take his advice. I'll placate him, whatever it may be. Wouldn't be placated. But the average person in this situation may, yes. And ultimately, you never know where that allowing that person to infiltrate and have some level of say and influence could be ultimately detrimental. You can be seduced not only by evil inclination, even by positive inclination. There's a famous word from the Chofetz Chaim. We have the blessings of the Shema in the evening, and the blessing that follows the Shema, the second blessing, we say over there, it's a supplication. We say, Hoseh sotim l'foneinu machareinu. Remove Satan from before us and from behind us. We speak about something as a stumbling block. There's a negative commandment. The Torah tells us, you're not permitted to put a stumbling block before a blind man. What does that mean? Does that mean to say a blind man's walking down the street? You're not permitted to put your foot out, he should fall over you trip over your leg. Of course, it does mean that, but it means much more than that. So the Talmud tells us, don't advise a person where the person believes that you're advising him for his own sake and you have ulterior motives and you're not advising him properly because you have a vested interest and therefore you're misleading him by doing the wrong thing for himself, although you're doing the right thing for yourself. It's a negative commandment. You're not permitted to do this. You can't put a stumbling block before a blind man. The Talmud tells us that if you have a person who's a Nazarite, who's not permitted to drink wine, and he comes to you and he wants to purchase wine from you, you're not permitted to sell him the wine. Why? Because you're creating a temptation that since he's not permitted to drink wine, by you selling the wine, although he'll tell you he's not going to drink it, you're not permitted to sell it to him. And if you do, even if he doesn't drink it, you're in violation of putting a stumbling block before a blind man. Because since there's a certain degree of temptation, because there's a prohibition, selling him something which is not permitted, you're not permitted to sell it to him for that reason. Okay? So we ask God, remove Satan from before us. He comes to us as lily white, and he convinces us, whatever he convinces us, it's the right thing to do. For instance, I'll tell you, as the Chofetz Chaim writes, we read in Pirkei Avos that a person should be giba kari. You should be strong like a lion. What is it referring to? Lasus ritzoncha. Lasus ritzon avich sheb'shmaim. You should be as strong as a lion to do the will of your Father in heaven. What does that mean? It's not so simple. We know the power of a lion. Of all, the lion is the king of the jungle. He has enormous strength. And when the lion is bent to do something, he cannot be stopped. That's how powerful the lion is. So the Chofetz Chaim writes, in Europe, they didn't have indoor heating. And you'd have to rise at dawn to go pray before you go to work. And here you're under this quilt or blanket, whatever it is that's providing some degree of warmth. And you could use the extra sleep maybe, and you have to go and expose yourself to cold. It's not so easy. So you have whisperings here, it's okay, stay a little bit longer. It's okay. But we convince ourselves. Having gibokar, be as strong as a lion. That the moment you have to do something, you block out all whisperings. You do what you have to do. This is gibokari, no matter what. Although you have temptation, because you have such an understanding of what is important, that overpowers everything. Nothing interferes with your will. That's how iron-willed you are. That's the meaning. You should be strong like a lion, to do the will of your Father in heaven. So we ask God, remove Satan from before us. Satan comes with such convincing argument that we could be convinced. We ask God, take him away from. He should not be before us. That stumbling block, let him not hoodwink us. That's what about me'acharenu? What about from behind us? So the Chofetz Chaim used to say that, let's say that the evil inclination can't in any way impede you, stop you from doing the right thing. But what he could do is he can encourage you to indulge in doing the right thing to the point where the person can't do it any longer. For instance, if a person needs a certain minimum amount of sleep and he doesn't because he wants to do the mitzvah, but ultimately he abuses his health. And because he abuses his health, medically speaking, the doctor says, you know something? For the next 6 months, you can't study at all. Because your health has been so compromised due to being committed to study as you've been doing. You've compromised your health. So initially, when you did it, you're doing a mitzvah. You're doing the right thing. That's ma'acharenu. If he can't stop you from studying, he says, no, something, I'm going to put you into overdrive. And when he puts you into overdrive, sometimes you drive right off the cliff. And you don't realize, and he can push you off the cliff. So we ask God to protect us from Satan before us and behind us. Because sometimes if he can't hoodwink us by presenting something very attractive, he'll push us from behind to the point where we fall on our faces and we can't get up. That's what we ask God. Both positive and negative inclination. Even when it's something positive, but is it really the right thing? Because we feel if we succeeded in the financial area, we're experts. You got to be careful. Don't be seduced. And these words which I'm telling you, you should put on your hand, on your hearts, and on your souls. Meaning you got to take it to heart, and it's literally your life is upon this. But again, levavchem. This is levavchem. Meaning address both of the inclinations. You know, what's the difference between experienced and non-experienced? A person is mature, he's seen life to a degree. A young person is usually very idealistic. And he believes that because he is capable, what the older person tells him, that he has to be careful, he believes that's him, but not him. The older person is subject to that, but he's not, because he feels that he has the capability and that's his idealism, and he'll go for it because he hasn't seen life sufficiently that he understands there's nothing perfect in life. And there are many pitfalls in life. And although everything seems to be, everything should make it work and succeed, it's not necessarily the case. We believe things should succeed, but there's so many variables till something comes to fruition. So the person who's been well-weathered in many areas, he understands it's not so simple. So he tries to advise the younger person. The younger person appreciates the advice and heeds the advice, he'll grow from it. If not, he'll have to learn from his own mistakes. That's what we'll have to do. And very often we do learn from mistakes because we realize that maybe we're too arrogant or we weren't experienced enough. And that's part of maturity, that's part of growth. So the Torah tells us in this paragraph from the Shema, since this is the reality of life, that when you succeed, the ego is stroked and you believe you understand it better. And we don't learn from our mistakes. But ultimately, you're going to be seduced and you have everything. And then afterwards, God's going to take you down. If God's wrath is expressed, you're going to lose it all. You're going to be driven from the land. You'll be destroyed from the land. You know, there's a famous word from Rameh Simcha of Vinsk. You know, we find in the Torah the two portions of curses. One is the last portion of the book of Vayikra, Bechukosai, the end of Leviticus, and the other one we just had in the book of Dvorim, Kisovo. He writes in Bechukosai, in that set of curses, that he says if you track the history of the Jewish people from the time of the destruction of the temple until his time, which he lived in the mid-19th century into the very early part of the 20th century, he says you will find that Jews, the Jewish people, when they were exiled or displaced or experienced serious pogroms, the Jews themselves were very pious and committed to God. Because as they entered into new societies and the governments saw their abilities and they were valued for their ingenuity in the material and the economy, and they started to rise economically, as they rose economically and they climbed that economic ladder, they started to shed their Judaism. And as they rose that economic ladder, there was less of the Judaism with them. And when they reached the pinnacle of their financial power, everything just totally exploded or imploded. And this cycle repeats itself continuously. He says, if you follow this cycle, the Jews, when originally they went to Spain, it was the golden era of Spain. And what happened? The Jews themselves had very powerful positions in the Spanish government. For instance, Abarbanel, who was a great commentator on the Torah, he was the finance minister of King Ferdinand, the one who actually time of the Spanish Inquisition. He was actually the head of the armed forces of the Spanish army. He had many positions. And when they issued the Inquisition and the Jews were driven out of Spain, he said, you'll be the exception. He says, if my brothers go, I go. And they all left with very little. Who stayed behind? The Marranos. Who were the Marranos? The Marranos were the Jews who had tremendous wealth. They had high positions in government. They had power. So it's written about the Marranos. They were Spaniards first and Jews second. That Judaism was not first and foremost. The Jews who left Spain, the Judaism were first. They weren't going to live in the open as Christians and in private they could be Jews. Because ultimately the Marranos, the majority of them, they eventually assimilated. If they were not found out early enough and they were actually burnt at the stake. But the Jews who were Jews first, they said, we're giving up all the material, all the power for the sake of our belief. Those who stayed behind, they were Spaniards first and they were Jews second. And as a result of that, they eventually disappeared. That's what happened. But why? Because they felt we could actually have the cake and eat it. We could be Jews, and for the sake of whatever may be, the power, we're able to, we'll be a light unto the nations. We'll offer our services. We have the best of both worlds. Doesn't work that way. You can't sell God short. God says, you sell me short, then you short it out totally. You end up with nothing. That's what happens. It's very interesting. I always say a person's worth $100 million. And he believes that as the Torah tells us, it's the power and it's my acumen that brought about all this. And he starts misbehaving. So what does God do? God topples him to the point he has nothing. So he goes from 100 million that he doesn't have 2 nickels to rub together. And he's learned his lesson. Well, he realizes it's due to his arrogance. So what does he do? He goes and again starts all over. And now he's worth $10 million. Today he's singing God's praises with $10 million because he learned his lesson. But if you would have sung God's praises when you had $100 million, maybe today you could have had $100 million or $200 million. But because you were arrogant, God topples you. Now you have a fraction of that, and now you see it better, and you're more than happy that you have 10, which is only a fraction what you originally had. But we don't learn our lesson. So why be arrogant when you have it all? Because ultimately it's going to be taken from you, and then afterwards you're going to be appreciative for less. We could have it more. You could be appreciative when you have more, but that's not the reality of people. And this is the cycle. Unfortunately, that's the cycle. There's a story with the Chafetz Chaim that he had a student, was an exceptional student, and he married into a family that was very wealthy. And his father-in-law gave him a certain amount of money to invest, to go into business for himself. And he was like the envy of all his peers. Okay? A year later, whatever investment he made, he lost it all. A year later. So it was known the Chafetz Chaim, if he would give a blessing, his blessing always came to fruition. So he comes to the Chafetz Chaim to share with him his pain. Here he had all this opportunity, and he made this investment, whether he was deceived or whatever it was, and went south, it soured. So the Chafetz Chaim has a slight smile on his face. Could you imagine? Here this person is in pain because of the financial loss he took and the embarrassment he has, and so on and so forth. And the Chafetz Chaim is smiling. And the Chafetz Chaim was a very holy man. He's not going to actually rejoice in somebody else's pain. So the person says to the Chafetz Chaim, why is the Rebbe smiling? He says, you don't understand. You can't imagine how good God has been to you. He says the cycle of wealth in those days was wealth lasted 10 years, 20 years. That was the cycle in Europe. Unless it was very unusual, you had a family, it was like a dynasty, like the Rothschilds. The wealth went from generation to generation. Most people, they had a number of good years, and for whatever reason is, afterwards, they lost the wealth due to whatever reasons. Markets, whether the government confiscated, whatever it was. So he says, you realize if you would have had this wealth for 10 years and you would have been not involved in your studies for 10 years, then you lost it. Do you think you could get back to where you were when you left? You wouldn't have the knowledge and the feeling towards your studies wouldn't be the same. God was kind to you. Since ultimately you're going to lose it anyway, eventually. You lost it soon enough that you weren't compromised regarding your Torah studies. That's why I'm smiling, because God smiled upon you, and rather than waiting 10 years for you to lose it, you lost it immediately, because God wanted you to retain your studies and your feeling and your commitment to Him. So that's positive, it's not negative. I said over a story on Friday, it wasn't this class, where there was a certain person, he was a Sephardic Jew, and went to graduate school, and for whatever reason, couldn't get a job. Gave his resume around, so he asked me, could I help him? And it happened to be at that time, he was living with a woman, a Jewish woman, which is not permitted. It was not his wife, and there were many problems. So I said to him, how do you expect God to help you to find a job? And he's a person believing in God. Person put on tefillin every day. If you're not behaving, God says, you know something, stop behaving. I'll help you with a job to find a position. You're not behaving. So he says, but all my friends are doing the same thing. And they're doing well. Why is God picking on me? That's what he said to me. Why is God picking on me? I said, you don't understand. God is and these are the words I said. God is slapping you around because God cares about you. Because he wants you to behave. Therefore, he's teaching you a lesson. You behave, you can find a job. You don't behave, you're going to be out there with your hat in your hand. The other people, for whatever reason, God doesn't have the same concern about them as he has about you. So see it as a positive, not as a negative. That's it. So whenever something negative happens, very often, and we do some level of introspection, we realize we're far from perfect. Far from perfect. There's a lot of correction that has to be done. Whether it's the way we treat people, what we call Bein Adam L'Chavero, our relationships between man and man, our relationship with man and God. And, we believe we have a right, and we become the experts on Judaism to do many things which are not justifiable. Only when you get it in the solar plexus and you can't catch your breath and say, what's going on over here? Then you have to wake up. Do you get upset with God? Or do you say, something? Are you humble and say, maybe I better get some professional reading on this? And you go to the rabbi. And if the rabbi is the right rabbi, he'll give you some clarity, give you some pointers on how to make corrections, and hopefully it'll be better. I was saying to somebody just yesterday, a few days ago, on Rosh Hashanah, it's the day of judgment. Everything is decided for this coming year on Rosh Hashanah, but it's in abeyance through Yom Kippur. By the end of Yom Kippur, everything is sealed, basically. Financial, and we say in the sign of Tokef, who will live, who will die? Who will die by the sword, by drowning, by fire, whatever it is. This we say in the service. Who will live, who will die? Mi becherev, mi b'magefa, by the sword, by the plague, by many things. 2.5 years ago, we had the COVID. We had the coronavirus. It was a global plague. Who would have believed it? But the previous year, God had decided on Rosh Hashanah or in Yom Kippur, the world is going to be overwhelmed with the plague. The world's going to be shut down. And there was no escape. Okay? 8 months ago, you had Russia, you had the Ukraine. People in Ukraine lived in peace. Although there was always this tension between Russia and the Ukraine. What has happened the past 8-9 months to the Ukraine due to Russia's invasion? The genocide, the suffering, the killing, the cruelty, and the world and where things are at, and what could happen due to whatever's going on between them. Mass graves, who would have believed this? But you want to know? That already was decided a year ago, Rosh Hashanah, that was meant to happen. All the displacement. So you never know what's coming down the pipe. You know what's when you turn that corner, what's happening. You never know. We all know factually we're not perfect. Any person says he's perfect is arrogant. So we say we're not perfect, but are we that imperfect? Maybe we have to look ourselves in the mirror and do some introspection. Look, you can't do more than your best. But to even give it even address, to give it within the realm of what we could do, it's okay. But maybe God said it's not okay. It's okay if I didn't pay my taxes. But when you get the letter from the IRS, they wanted to send somebody down to do an audit, now you realize it may not be so okay. But until then, where was your head? Don't you think eventually they may find you out? Well, maybe they won't, but now they have. So with the IRS, they may not find you out, but God always finds you out. Because nothing goes unnoticed by God. He may have reasons to wait before he lets the second shooter drop. But it's a reality. And that's the reality of the time we're holding at this moment between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Because every decision that affects our lives, our health, our wealth, our safety, our families, our communities, every iota, nuance that will affect our lives this coming year is decided at this moment. And it's concluded at the end of Yom Kippur. So if we're smart and responsible and semi-intelligent, and that's what we say to Krishna, but I have such success, how could I be wrong? God has given you so much. You could be seduced by your hearts. We can convince ourselves with God's gift to humanity. How can we do the wrong thing? We have a right. Unfortunately, when God's wrath is what's expressed, it's all meaningless. Jews during World War II, when the Nazis came into countries, Jews were wealthy, Jews were secure, Jews were arrogant. The moment they came in, your financial status meant nothing, your social status meant nothing, your goodwill meant nothing, nothing meant anything. He didn't differentiate whether you were a pauper, whether you're unstable, stable, educated, uneducated, you're all the same. You're all subject, you're all going to the gas chamber. You're all going to the crematorium. Didn't make a difference. But only then did they realize, but people have short memories. Right after the war, people were back right to where they were. People were vying for power, but we all have short memories. But that's the same thing. That's the cycle of life. And these are the challenges of life. And that's what we say in the second paragraph of the Shema. We're committed, and God gives us blessing and success and power, this and that. You better be careful. At that moment, now you're in a position of vulnerability. You could be hoodwinked in a way that you don't even realize where you're going. And ultimately, you believe that you determine who God is, who God's not. And when that happens, then you go off the cliff, and God forbid, and there's nothing left.